so you'll have to bear with me. I'm a little bit out of sorts. But I thought I would actually just talk to the works quite plainly and simply, and then at the end we'll have them open for questions or any kind of discussion around work. So the paintings are figurative and landscapes, the natural surroundings. And I just wanted to talk to the history of figurative painting, not that I have the full knowledge of it, but just some of it's going to be quite opinionated, which is also fine. But there is a long tradition, a long line of figurative paintings, right back to prehistoric age. And my wonderful research based on Wikipedia told me that the oldest figurative painting is 43,900 years old, depicting peak hunting. There's actually quite a lot of works around that, which is quite interesting. There's something that's very enduring about figurative painting that even now, as we have figures on billboards, TV, magazines, figurative painting still exists, which is quite fantastic. Through generations, it persists to be a form of translating an innate representation of humanity. Here's where my opinion is. But I believe there to be three types of portrayal of a painted figure. The first one is narrative, the second one is portraiture, and the third one is self-portrait. So narrative paintings, I just did a little, so excuse the little screen TV, but I figured it's good to have some visuals behind the talk in case you're not, so you can follow easily. So narrative paintings obviously were stories of myths or religious stories of historical and stories of events. Now we're used to TV or movies which play out stories over quite a few scenarios and quite a few scenes, where narrative painting I find really interesting because it's all in one scene, in one plane, where the whole narrative just situates in the one still. So it's not drawn out and it's not read over a period of time, but everything's thrown at the one canvas. So there's subject matter, the figures are theatrical, the story gets played out in that one sitting. So the second one, portraiture, is quite simple. I call it the still life configuration. It's just some examples of the seated portrait or standing portrait. Not usually any meaning behind it, just usually the style of the artist is inflicted on the portrait, but other than that, it's just a representation of the figure. Now the self-portrait is where I kind of want to talk about most, because that's where I find my work to be more situated. I feel that self-portraiture is kind of the in-between of narrative and portrait, so I will talk about that a little bit. It's just an example of a self-portrait. So the portrait itself, or stand-still life portrait, is quite distant from the viewer, whereas a self-portrait has more of an intimate connection to the viewer because you're instantly in the world of the artist, and some of them, self-portraits can be quite disturbed based on the artist kind of either exposing or representing themselves in a particular way. So I feel that there's a real move from just standard portrait to self-portraiture. And the artist that I feel we'll be talking about that best represents self-portraiture in this particular way is Georgio De Shirakay. There's something, he's known originally for his metaphysical art movement that he started, and he influenced the surrealists. And he produced diverse series of works. So in the beginning, his conjured narratives were quite dreamlike, and also then post-World War I, there was kind of political things going on there, but he constructed narrative works in his early career. I didn't put them up, but and he painted still life portraits as well. But moving on to his self-portraits, which I believe to be his best works, where he costumes himself in matador outfits and puts himself. Yeah, I find them very unabashed and personal, and quirky at the same time. And then he followed on to paint a series of horses, which I also believe to be self-portrait in context as well, even though they're not a portrait of him. This is kind of where I'm leading into my works. I find that his horses are also very figurative, very stylized, and they're almost more humanistic than animalistic. They're overly romanticised, indulgent, and fanciful. They mirror his self-portraits in a subliminal way, which is intrinsic with the self-portrait artist. The self-portrait is anecdotal of a personal narrative. Yeah, so I'll just talk about my work now. So they're not overtly narrative in the sense that the image purposefully is not trying to give a full reading of one scene. They're decompartmentalised. Areas are individual figments that piece together an internal narrative. So methods that I use that help interpret this is paint application, colour, clashes, textures of thick versus thin, contrasts of clutter and space. All these methods purposefully enforce the context. So, in conclusion, where my works are situated is the realm of self-portraiture, the in-between of narrative and portraiture. They linger in a fantastical world. They are metamorphose of reality to imagination to a dreamlike fantasy. Yes, that's what Yes, so.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Huh?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Just one question. Are you still working out, I know that a long time ago you were working out how you were feeling when you were doing your self-portraits.
Yeah.
Are you still doing that with your work?
Yeah.
Do you think? Yeah. So what's going on around you is actually coming out on it.
Yeah, so they're pretty much completely autobiographical in that sense.
Cool.
Yeah. So even the figures are of others or, people that you can't. I think actually I missed a whole page where I was talking about that, that's alright. Where the landscape is abstracted, so the landscape's not landscape, you can't locate it, it doesn't look like a place or a time or a point in history. And the same with the figures, they're either naked or just clothed in a garment, but they're not, it's not to a fashion or a particular time, so they're not, they're kind of a bit more enduring, they go, So I purposely use those methods so that you can't really locate where it is or what it is, but the autobiographical nature comes out in the moods of textures and the colours. And,
So are the cats like your version of his horses? Is that the tigers and lions? Yeah. So it's kind of, that's why I actually introduced the animalistic side of it,
was, it's quite figurative to me as well. Like obviously there's wild nature about it, there's fearfulness about it with the big cats or whatever it is, but then they're kind of classically placed on the canvas. So on one hand it's pulling on kind of a tense thing where you think it's a, you know, an aggressive animal, but then they're happily seated with the figure, and yeah, so playing on those things.
Yvonne,
Yes.
I mean, you make very clear the connection you have, or the interest you have in the Shirakay, but I'm kind of curious in this dense Helen with outside the world. Where do you make any relationship to anything in terms of New Zealand painting? Where you might feel these works are connected?
To New Zealand?
Yeah, the context of New Zealand painting.
Well, because I know you've actually asked that probably a long time ago as well, but it's not that I don't feel connected to New Zealand, it's more that in talking about personal matters or emotions or inside narratives, I don't really need to relate it to New Zealand in a sense, just because I live here, using things that distract from the fact that I'm a Kiwi or I'm a New Zealander, you know, not having to put the herd culture into like fantails or New Zealand animals or anything, because there's so many things around the world, there's, you know, landscape or animals or that represent certain motives that almost help the work better than just putting it in a location because I live there.
If I can be